He was my boss, the man who signed my paychecks, who corrected my reports in red ink, who never once smiled at me in the office. So why every single night at exactly 11:47 did my phone light up with his name? Not a work email, not a deadline reminder, just him asking if I'd eaten dinner, asking if I was okay. For 3 months, those messages were the only thing that made me feel seen. But I never asked myself the one question that could have saved me from everything that came after. Why does a powerful man like him need to hide behind a phone screen at midnight? I didn't know that somewhere in his past was a secret he'd buried so deep, even he was starting to forget it wasn't gone. I didn't know that loving him would mean choosing between the truth and the only happiness I'd ever known. Stay with me, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. The rain in the city never seemed to stop that autumn, and neither did the ache in Dylan Cortez's chest every time he walked past the glass office on the 40th floor. He was 26, a junior financial analyst who had learned to disappear inside spreadsheets because disappearing was safer than being noticed. His father had made sure of that lesson years ago, back when being noticed for who Dylan really was had cost him a home. So Dylan built a smaller life, work, a quiet apartment. A cat named Soup, nothing that could be taken from him twice. His boss, Adrian Voss, was 34, unreadable and famous in the office for two things: closing impossible deals and never once discussing his personal life. People whispered that Adrian had a fiancée somewhere or a wife or nothing at all. Nobody actually knew. He moved through the building like a closed door. Until the night Dylan stayed late finishing a report and Adrian, buttoning his coat by the elevator, stopped and asked quietly, "Have you eaten?" It was such a small question, Dylan almost laughed, but something in the way Adrian asked it, careful, like he was afraid of getting an answer he didn't deserve, made the question feel enormous. That night at 11:47, Dylan's phone lit up. "Did you get home safe?" Just 4 words from a man who barely spoke to him in daylight. Dylan stared at the screen for a long time before answering. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that for 3 weeks, until the messages became the part of his day he waited for most. Adrian never texted about work. He asked what music Dylan listened to when he couldn't sleep. He asked if Dylan believed people could change. He never called, never asked to meet outside the office, as if the phone screen was a door he was only brave enough to speak through when no one could see his face. Dylan began to notice the way Adrian's eyes lingered a half-second too long in meetings, the way his voice softened only for him. And still, nothing happened in daylight. It was as if Adrian existed twice: a cold executive by sun and a frightened, gentle stranger by midnight, and Dylan didn't yet understand that the distance between those two men was the whole story. The first crack in the mystery came on a Thursday when Adrian's assistant, Priya, pulled Dylan aside near the copy room and said without any warmth, "Be careful." When Dylan asked what she meant, she only shook her head. "Just ask him about Marcus sometime, see what happens to his face." Dylan didn't ask, not yet. He was too afraid of breaking whatever fragile, nameless thing was growing between two people who had never even held hands. It happened on a night heavy with rain, the kind that turned city lights into rivers on the pavement. Dylan had stayed behind again, and Adrian, instead of texting from his office 3 doors down, walked over and stood in the doorway like a man arriving somewhere he'd been circling for months. "I keep telling myself I'll stop texting you," Adrian said. "And then 11:47 comes and I can't help it." Dylan's heart was loud enough to hear. "Why 11:47?" he asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Because that's when the building empties out, when nobody's watching. It's the only time I let myself be honest." He looked at Dylan like the words cost him something. "I don't know how to do this in the light." That was the night Dylan learned Adrian's hands shook when he was scared, and that fear had nothing to do with rejection, and everything to do with a man named Marcus, a name Adrian said only once, and only in a whisper, before changing the subject like it burned him. Weeks folded into each other. The texts turned into late walks. The late walks turned into a hand brushing another hand and neither of them pulling away. Adrian began arriving early just to see Dylan's coffee order right. Dylan began saving every message, rereading them on the subway like proof that he was allowed to be loved. For the first time since he was 17 years old, Dylan let himself imagine an entire future instead of a single safe day. And Adrian, for the first time in years, said the words, "I want you," out loud in daylight in his office with the door open, a small, defiant act that meant more to Dylan than any love letter could. But happiness that arrives quietly rarely stays quiet for long. The reveal came from a company gala of all places, under gold lighting and 100 watching eyes. An older man approached Adrian with a familiarity that made the room go still and said, "It's been a long time since Marcus." Adrian's face went the color of paper. Dylan, 3 feet away, felt the floor tilt. He learned that night from a stranger's careless mouth that Marcus had been Adrian's husband. That Marcus had died 2 years earlier in a car accident on a rain-soaked road, not unlike the ones Adrian now walked every night at 11:47, the exact hour Marcus used to call him from work. Adrian hadn't been chasing romance in the dark. He'd been reliving the last hour he ever felt safe, terrified that moving forward meant betraying a man he'd promised forever to. Dylan didn't confront him at the gala. He waited until they were both outside, rain falling around the golden windows like the world was crying on their behalf. "You should have told me," Dylan said, voice shaking, not from anger but from grief he hadn't earned and now carried anyway. Adrian's eyes were wet. "I didn't want you to be his replacement," he said. "I wanted you to be the reason I stopped waiting for a text that will never come again." He reached for Dylan's hand. "But I was still living in that hour with a ghost, and it wasn't fair to bring you into it without telling you the truth." For 11 days, Dylan didn't answer a single message. Not out of cruelty, but because loving a man still tethered to grief felt like reaching for someone standing at the edge of a cliff. You didn't know if pulling him toward you would save him or pull you both over. He spent those 11 days talking to his own therapist for the first time in years. Finally saying out loud that he was afraid of being loved as an echo instead of as himself. It was Adrian who broke the silence, not with a text at 11:47 but with a knock on Dylan's door at 2 in the afternoon in full daylight, holding nothing but himself and no excuse prepared. "I'm not asking you to fix what happened to me," he said, standing in the hallway like a man who had finally chosen to be seen. "I'm asking if there's room in my life for a love that isn't measured against the one I lost. I don't want the dark anymore, Dylan. I want the 2 o'clock sun. I want you to see all of me, not just the version brave enough to hide behind a screen." Dylan studied him for a long moment, the shaking hands, the honesty that had finally crawled into the light and stepped aside to let him in. They didn't rush forward from there. They rebuilt slowly, the way anything meant to last is built, through Sunday mornings instead of midnight texts, through Adrian finally saying Marcus's name without flinching, through Dylan learning that loving someone who has grieved doesn't mean competing with a memory, only making room beside it. Adrian eventually told the story of Marcus at his own pace, in pieces over months, and each time he did, some of the fear in his eyes disappeared a little more. Dylan, in turn, told Adrian about the father who once made him feel unlovable, and Adrian listened the way no one ever had, like every piece of him was worth staying for. A year later, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday with no rain at all, Dylan's phone buzzed at exactly 11:47 in the morning. It was a photo of 2 coffee cups on Adrian's desk and a message that read simply, "Come find me." In the light this time, Dylan smiled the whole elevator ride up, understanding at last that the most powerful kind of love isn't the one that hides in the safety of midnight, but the one brave enough to walk into an office in broad daylight and stay. A year of daylight had healed almost everything. Almost. Because just when Dylan Cortez finally believed he and Adrian Voss had outrun the past, a letter arrived that neither of them had asked for, one written by a dead man, meant to be opened only if Adrian ever fell in love again. "I thought grief only looked backward. I was wrong." That letter didn't just reopen an old wound, it asked Adrian a question he never had the courage to answer while Marcus was alive, and answering it now could either set him free or cost him the one person who'd taught him how to love without fear. "I wish I could tell you it was simple. It wasn't. Because the second I found out what that letter said, I understood that some secrets don't stay buried just because the person who kept them is gone." Stay with me, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Spring had softened the city by the time the envelope arrived. Plain and unmarked, except for a single line in handwriting Adrian recognized instantly. "Open this only if you love someone again." It had been sitting in a lawyer's drawer for 2 years, part of an old instruction Marcus left behind long before the accident, back when he was healthy and joking about outliving them all. Adrian stood frozen in the kitchen with it, the morning light doing nothing to steady his hands the way it usually did now. Dylan watched from the doorway, coffee going cold in his palms, and understood before a single word was spoken that the past had just knocked on their door uninvited. "You don't have to open it today," Dylan said gently. Adrian shook his head. "If I wait, I'll never do it." His voice cracked on the last word, and Dylan crossed the kitchen and simply stood beside him, not touching, just present. The way he'd learned mattered more than any speech. Inside the envelope was a single page. Marcus had written it not as a goodbye but as a question he'd never had the nerve to ask while he was alive. "Would you ever want to build a family? Not someday, for real. I always wanted to ask you properly and I kept putting it off because I was scared of the answer. If you're reading this, it means life gave you a second chance to be brave. Don't waste it like I did." Adrian sat down at the table like the floor had tilted. It wasn't grief that hit him first, it was guilt, sharp and sudden, for a conversation he'd avoided for years with a man who was no longer there to have it. Dylan, reading the ache in his face, asked carefully, "Is this about wanting kids or about wanting to prove something to him?" It was the exact question Adrian needed and dreaded in equal measure. For the first time since the gala, an old fear crept back between them, not because Dylan doubted Adrian's love, but because he suddenly doubted his place in a future that had been quietly promised to someone else long before he arrived. I don't want to be the man who finally gets brave for a question meant for somebody else, Dylan admitted one night, sitting on the balcony while the city hummed below them. Adrian's answer came slower than Dylan wanted, and in the silence before it, doubt found room to grow. Weeks passed strangely, tender in the mornings, careful and distant by night, as though both men were circling the same fear from opposite directions. Adrian buried himself in work again, the way he used to before Dylan. Dylan, sensing himself being quietly shut out, began to wonder if loving a man with a ghost this large would always mean coming second to a memory, no matter how many daylight mornings they built together. The turn came from an unexpected place. Priya, Adrian's assistant, the same woman who had once warned Dylan to be careful. She found him alone in the break room and said without her usual guarded tone, "Marcus asked Adrian that same question 3 years ago, out loud." Adrian never answered him either. He just changed the subject and pretended it never happened. "That's the real reason that letter is destroying him. It's not new pain, Dylan. It's an old regret that finally caught up." For the first time, Dylan understood this wasn't a contest between him and Marcus. It was Adrian, still terrified of wanting a full life out loud, still punishing himself for a silence he never broke in time. That night, Dylan didn't wait for 11:47. He knocked on Adrian's office door at 6 p.m. while the sun was still warm on the windows and said, "You're not being asked to choose between us. You're being asked if you're finally ready to want something without running from it, and this time I'm not going anywhere while you figure that out." Adrian's composure, the same composure that had once made him seem unreachable in every meeting, finally broke completely, not from sadness, but from relief so overwhelming it looked almost like laughter through tears. "I do want it," Adrian said, voice raw. "I wanted it back then and I was too scared to say it, and I've spent 2 years telling myself I don't deserve to say it now, but I want a family. I want mornings that are loud and messy and full of noise neither of us has to apologize for. I want it with you, Dylan, not because Marcus asked the question first, because you're the one who taught me it's safe to answer it." They didn't rush the decision because rushing had never been how they loved each other. Over the following months they talked, really talked, about what a future like that would look like, about adoption, about the kind of father each of them had grown up needing and never had, about how healing doesn't erase grief but simply learns to carry it more gently. Adrian visited Marcus's grave one final time that summer, not to say goodbye, but to say thank you, leaving the unopened half of his own reply folded beneath a stone, a private conversation meant only for the two of them. On a warm evening nearly 2 years to the day since that first quiet elevator question, "Have you eat?" Adrian came home to find Dylan on the balcony, phone in hand, staring at a message that had just arrived. It wasn't from Adrian. It was a reply from an adoption agency confirming their first home visit. Dylan looked up as Adrian sat beside him, their hands finding each other without needing to be asked, and said only, "Looks like we're finally going to be loud." Adrian laughed, a full unguarded sound Dylan hadn't heard even once in all those early midnight messages, and pulled him close. Somewhere in that ordinary evening light with no rain and no secrets left to hide, two men who had once only dared to be honest in the dark finally built something loud enough and brave enough to last. They had survived grief. They had survived a dead man's letter. I thought that meant they had survived everything the world could throw at them. I was wrong. Because 3 weeks before their first home visit, a phone call came that neither of them expected from a hospital about a man Dylan hadn't spoken to in 9 years. His father. The same man who once told a 17-year-old Dylan he wasn't welcome in his own house for being exactly who he was. Now that man was asking to see him, and Dylan had to decide whether forgiveness was something you owed someone or something you were allowed to refuse. What he didn't know yet was that the answer to that question would decide far more than an old wound. It would decide whether the family he and Adrian were building could survive being tested by the family he'd already lost. Stay with me because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. The call came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. A nurse's voice, calm and practiced, explained that Reynaldo Cortez had suffered a stroke, that he was stable but asking for his son, that he had in fact been asking for months even before this. Dylan stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended, the same kitchen where a letter from a dead man had once changed everything, and felt something cold settle in his chest that even Adrian's hand on his shoulder couldn't immediately warm. "You don't owe him anything," Adrian said quietly, echoing words Dylan himself had once used to comfort him. "But if you want to see him, I'll go with you." Dylan didn't answer right away. 9 years of silence had built a wall he wasn't sure he wanted torn down, especially not now with a home visit approaching and a future he'd finally stopped being afraid of. They didn't go that week. Dylan told himself he needed time, though the truth was closer to fear that seeing his father again would undo the peace he'd built so carefully, piece by piece, ever since a man in a glass office had asked if he'd eaten dinner. But the hospital called twice more, and on the third call something in Dylan cracked open despite himself, and he agreed to go, if only to prove to himself that he no longer needed his father's permission to be happy. The hospital room was smaller than Dylan remembered his father being. Reynaldo, gray now and thinner, watched his son cross the room with an expression Dylan had never once seen on his face growing up, not anger, not disappointment, but something dangerously close to shame. "I didn't think you'd come," Reynaldo said, voice thin from the stroke. "I almost didn't," Dylan answered honestly, standing at a careful distance, unwilling to pretend the years hadn't happened. What followed wasn't the apology Dylan had imagined 100 times in his angriest years, nor the reconciliation he'd quietly hoped for in his gentlest ones. It was messier than both, a man too proud and too frightened to say the words directly, instead saying, "Your mother kept every letter you sent for the first 2 years. I burned mine before I ever read them. I thought that made me strong." Dylan felt tears he hadn't given permission to fall. "It didn't make you strong," he said. "It just made both of us alone for 9 years we didn't have to lose." Adrian waited outside that door, respecting a conversation that wasn't his to be part of, and it was there in a fluorescent hospital hallway that an unexpected complication arrived. A social worker named Alina Marsh, assigned to their adoption case, who happened to be visiting a different patient on the same floor and recognized Adrian from an earlier interview. She approached carefully, professionally, but what she said next made the hallway feel smaller than the hospital room down it. "I have to be honest with you both. A relative reaching out during an active evaluation period can complicate the report, especially given how recent and unresolved this seems. I'm required to document any major family developments before the visit." The words landed like a verdict neither man had prepared for. Dylan, still raw from his father's hospital room, now faced the terrifying possibility that reopening one wound might cost them the family they were trying to build. "This isn't fair," he said, quiet and furious. "I didn't ask for any of this to happen right now." Adrian, steady in the way Dylan had grown to rely on, took his hand in the hallway without caring who saw. "Then we don't hide it," he said. "We tell the truth, all of it, and we trust that the truth is enough. Hiding things almost cost us everything once already. I won't do that again, not even to protect us." The days that followed were among the hardest of their relationship, not because of distance between them, but because both were forced to be painfully honest in front of strangers with clipboards, explaining grief, estrangement, and healing to people whose job was to judge whether their love was stable enough for a child. Dylan spoke, for the first time to anyone outside Adrian, about being told at 17 that his own father found him unlovable. Adrian spoke about Marcus, about the letter, about learning that surviving loss wasn't the same as being broken. Alina Marsh listened to all of it without flinching, and at the end of the final interview said only, "Most people try to hide the hard parts. You didn't. That tells me more than a perfect story ever could." Reynaldo Cortez did not recover the way doctors hoped, but he recovered enough to sit up, enough to speak clearly, enough for Dylan to visit twice more before the home visit finally arrived, not out of obligation, but because some quiet, stubborn part of Dylan still wanted his father to know the truth, that he had built a good life, a full life, entirely without needing his father's blessing to do it. On the second visit, Reynaldo asked haltingly, "Is he good to you, the man you love?" Dylan, surprised by the question, only nodded. "Better than good," he said. "He waited for me to be ready for 9 years I didn't even know I needed." Reynaldo closed his eyes. "Then I was wrong," he said, "about all of it." It wasn't the full apology Dylan once dreamed of, but it was enough to close a door that had been open, aching for far too long. The home visit itself, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that led to it. Sunlight through open windows, Adrian nervously straightening a picture frame for the third time, Dylan laughing at him for it, Alina Marsh smiling for the first time as she noted simply, "This home already sounds like a family. The paperwork is just going to make it official." 3 months later, a phone call came that neither of them will ever forget, the exact sound of not a stranger's voice this time, but Alina's, warm and unmistakably pleased, saying only, "Are you both sitting down? Because I think it's time you two met your daughter." Adrian dropped the phone. Dylan picked it up, laughing through tears neither of them bothered hiding. And somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, in an apartment that had once only known midnight texts and quiet fear, two men who had each spent years believing they weren't allowed to be loved out loud finally understood that the family they'd built wasn't a replacement for anything they'd lost. It was proof that they had never stopped choosing each other, one brave daylight moment at a time.